Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Sharon Skembry and I'm here today to talk to you about international business. We're working from Charles Hill's textbook, it published in 2021 in its 13th edition, and we're specifically focused on Chapter 3 today. Chapter 3 is all about national differences in economic development. So we're going to share the screen here and we'll get going. All right. So the learning objectives for this chapter include explaining what determines the level of economic development of a nation, identifying the macro-political and the macroeconomic changes that are occurring globally, describing how transition economies are moving toward market-based systems, and we end the chapter with addressing the implications for management. So to introduce this concept of economic development, we're talking about the differences amongst nations that affects how attractive it is to do business in that nation or not, right? So the trends that foster greater economic development are recognised as democratic forms of government, market-based economic reforms, and legal systems that enforce property rights. To compare from nation to nation, we look at measures such as the gross national income, the GNI. The GNI measures the total annual income received by residents in that nation state. So Japan, Switzerland, Sweden, and the US have high GNI measures. China and India have low GNI measures. But it's important to recognise that GNI doesn't include differences in the cost of living. We turn to a different measure for that, the PPP, the Purchasing Power Parity. Okay, so here's a table confirming some of what we just said. The GNI for the United States and Switzerland and Japan is high. But for India and China, the GNI measure is low. Now, what's really interesting is that when we adjust the GNI to take into account the cost of living, and we're talking about the PPP measure now, you'll see that that measure increases from $62,000 to $63,000 per capita in the United States. In Switzerland, the GNI at $83,500 per capita, when we take into account cost of living, we end up with a PPP that's lower at $69,220. So what does that comparison tell us? It tells us that it's really expensive to live in Switzerland. And when you take into account the cost of living, the GNI in Switzerland drops. But in other countries, that's not the case. So, you know, look at the first two at this list, or even the first three, the first four, the first five on this list. In Brazil, the GNI, gross national income per capita in 2018 in Brazil was 9,140. When we take into account the cost of living, it increases to 15,820. So for India, similarly, we've got 2,000 as a GNI and more than 7,500 as a PPP. Okay, now we can recognize, if we switch down to this last cell in the bottom right corner here, we can recognize that the US has a far larger size of the economy, measured as GDP in billions of dollars, right? So 20.5 nearly billions of dollars, 20,494 billions of dollars in the US as a measure of the economy in the US. But look at the size of the economy in China, 13,608. $13,608 billion. Now, like we're saying in previous weeks, China is a rising economic power, and the annual growth rate is reflective of this. The annual growth rate of the GDP in the US in 2018 was 1.8%, whereas the annual growth rate in the GDP in 2018, from 2009 to 2018, for China was 8%. Look at India, 7.1%, relative to the US at 1.8, even the UK, 1.3. Okay, so interesting to look at data from across the world to compare different countries and how they're performing economically and in terms of development of the economy. You can turn to the International Monetary Fund Survey, which is published twice a year. And this is an analysis, this report that the IMF puts out twice a year is an analysis of global economic development. And it looks at all different things that affect industrialization of nations. It looks at not only developed countries, but developing countries and economies in transition. And what we need to recognize is that these official figures, of course, do not take into account the black economy, which of course is unrecorded cash. And so, you know, there may well be more or less money on the table that's not on the books. Okay, maybe it's under the table, right? So the GNI and the PPP data, we also need to recognize that these are static, and these are static measures and do not consider economic growth rates. So, for example, as we've just flagged, that China and India have high GDP growth rates from 2009 to 2018, China at 8%, India at 7.1%. And so what that means is that they are relatively poor countries, but their economies are growing very fast, in fact, faster than the US, far more. And so what's that going to mean long term? Probably that China will be the world's largest economy during the next decade, and India will also be at the top of that list. Now, when we're talking about economic development, experts on the issue, such as Professor Amartya Sen, he's a Harvard professor who has been awarded a Nobel Prize. He suggests that economic development needs to take into account the capabilities of the population and the opportunities for a particular citizenship. So according to his perspective, development requires the removal of impediments to freedom. And some of these impediments to freedom include poverty, tyranny, and poor economic opportunities. So in other words, what he's talking about is that economic progress requires the democratization of political communities so that people have a voice. So Professor Sen's ideas have been promoted by the United Nations to the extent that they implemented a human development index to measure the quality of life in different countries. This human development index takes into account life expectancy at birth. It takes into account the level of education attained by a population and whether the average incomes are sufficient to meet the basic needs of living in that country. On this map here, we have the Human Development Index indicated by red zones showing very high levels of development. So the US and Australia showing very high levels of human development, whereas the blue areas showing the lower levels of human development. Okay, so drivers of economic progress and stability in the political economy include or are recognised as innovation and entrepreneurship. Innovation, we're talking about product development, service development, organisational development, innovative management practices and strategic innovations. Entrepreneurship, we're talking about the commercialization of innovative ideas, innovative products and processes, and an entrepreneurial orientation within a nation is suggested to provide much of the dynamism in an economy. So it's a driver of the economy. But it's also recognised that innovation and entrepreneurship require a market-based economy. So the point is that there's little incentive to develop innovations when the state owns most of the means of production. So we can recognise that there's this strong relationship between economic freedom and economic growth. So for entrepreneurship and innovation to thrive, a nation state requires strong property rights. Without those strong property rights, individuals and businesses incur higher risk of their innovations and their profits being stolen. So, you know, when there's not strong property rights, it reduces the incentive for innovation and entrepreneurialism. Economist Hernando de Soto claims that inadequate property protection in developing nations limits economic growth. So democratic regimes are probably more conducive in the long term for economic growth, but we've seen evidence to the contrary. China, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, for example, these are undemocratic governments, but have demonstrated economic growth regardless. So property rights, we recognise, are only secure in well-functioning, mature democracies. In other types of political systems, property rights are not as secure. And yeah, so you know, the stronger orientation towards a totalitarian state is going to limit economic progress, because totalitarian states limit individual freedoms. They suppress human and economic development. So we can suggest, therefore, that economic progress begets democracy. Economic growth often leads to the emergence of democracy. And this is part of what we see going on in South Korea and Taiwan. Not so in China, but the point is made here that if China adopts a free market system, the belief is that the country will have greater individual freedoms followed by democracy. Okay, economist Jeffrey Sachs argues that countries with favourable geography are more likely to engage in trade. And we see this in Europe. European countries close by, you know, geographic proximity makes it easier to trade. We see this in Asia too. Some Asian countries that have close geographic proximity are going to be more inclined to trade. Australia and New Zealand trading with Asia. It's just easier. So these geographic regions may be more open to market-based systems with each other. Countries that invest in education also have higher economic development because the workforce is more productive, more sophisticated. The more educated the people, the more sophisticated the systems. And we've seen the rise of the Asian tigers in this regard. Countries in Southeast Asia have offset their geographic disadvantage relative to the rest of the world by investing in education. And indeed, they have even supported, economically, financially supported their citizens to travel to more developed nations to complete their education. So when we consider the political economy and economic progress, we need to consider things like geography and demographics. In terms of demographics, countries with a younger population have a greater growth potential. So when a population is growing, this is increasing the supply of labor. Younger workers tend to consume more than older workers. And an aging population, we've got an aging population trend that is evident globally, but evident more starkly in certain countries, such as Japan, for example. The older populations, the elderly population, they're not working, they're not paying tax. And so that implies a stress on the government finances and resources that will not be there in countries with a younger population, such as India. India has a younger population. So the political economy of nation states is marked by three trends. Democratic revolutions during the late 80s, early 90s led to greater commitment to free market capitalism. We saw a move away from centrally planned to mixed economies toward a more free market approach. And since 2005, there has been a shift back towards greater authoritarianism in some states. So these three trends are evidence of some nations that are in transition, either towards free market capitalism or retreating from the free market model. In 2019, Freedom House ranked countries into three broad categories. 86 countries were classified as free, so 44% of the world's nations. 59 countries were classified as partly free, 30% of nation states. 51 countries were classified as not free. Here's three reasons for the spread of democracy. Many totalitarian regimes have failed to deliver economic progress to the bulk of their nations, and so they fall over. And democracy rises. But also information technology and communication technology has spurred the spread of democracy. The Arab Spring, for example, in around about 2010 or thereabouts. So social media communications has enabled more, or internet technology in general actually has enabled greater access to information that was previously not accessible to the broader populations. And so, more information means a more informed people. And the third reason that's put forward by Hill in terms of a reason for the spread of democracy is that economic growth, economic advance has enabled a middle class to emerge. And this middle class, this increasing middle class population have pushed for democratic reforms, increased market-based reforms. So we said just earlier that since 2005, there has been a drift back towards more authoritarian modes of government in some nation states, unfortunately. Elections have been compromised, civil liberties have been restricted, independent press has been attacked, and opposition parties have been restricted. Sound familiar? Anyway, examples include Turkey, Russia, Ukraine, Indonesia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. And I've given you a link there to a news story by Reuters on the situation in Hungary. So Hungary is geographically in the middle of Europe there, and unfortunately, there is a rise of authoritarianism in Hungary. Okay. So this slide here is showing in red the countries that are not free. The green color is indicative of free countries. Okay, so Francis Fukuyama argues the New World Order will be characterized by democratic regimes and free market capitalism. Whereas political scientist Samuel Huntington argues that while many societies are modernizing, they're not necessarily becoming more Western. And so he predicts that there'll be a split into civilizations that will be in conflict. And of course, that increases the risk for those of us engaged in international business. So what does all of that mean? It means that probably we're going to end up somewhere in between what Fukuyama predicts and what Huntington predicts. What we do recognize currently is that there is a shift from centrally planned economies to market-based economies. More than 30 countries in the former Soviet Union and Eastern European communist bloc have changed economic systems. And we also see this same change happening in Asian countries and African states. So in other words, command and mixed economies fail to deliver the sustained economic growth that has been achieved in market-based economies. And so we see this spread of market-based systems. This is over the last 30 years, this spread of market-based systems and states in transition that have happened. So showing this economic freedom, we see that the red is indicating those nation states that do not have economic freedom, they're indeed repressed, whereas the green states are indicative of the higher levels of economic freedom. Note that United States and Canada, as well as the United Kingdom, are light green, whereas dark green, which is a higher measure of economic freedom, is shown to be in Australia and New Zealand and Ireland. There you go. And yet Americans quite often refer to Australia as socialist. Go figure. Anyway, this shift that we've seen in the last 30 years towards a market-based system involves deregulation, privatization, and a legal system that safeguards property rights. So let's break that down. Deregulation is about removing legal restrictions that inhibit the free market system. Their deregulation is about establishing and supporting private enterprise, and deregulation in mixed economies involves the same initiatives as in command economies. So the transition in a mixed economy was easier because the private sector was already there and operational. Privatization, we're talking about the transfer of ownership of state property into the hands of private individuals. So this might happen by selling utilities, for example, to privately owned corporations, or maybe it's selling shares to shareholders, and that can be you and me. So this trend of market privatization started in the early 80s in Britain with Margaret Thatcher. And, you know, Thatcherism was harsh, but it achieved and started a movement like no other. So Margaret Thatcher, you know, some people are very much against what happened in Great Britain in the early 80s. But then, you know, all these years later, we can see the benefits. In many nation states, economic activity is still in the hands of state-owned enterprises, and that doesn't guarantee economic growth. So for privatisation to work, it has to be paired with deregulation and opening of the economy. We also need legal systems that support a market economy. So we need legal systems that protect property rights and enforce contracts that have been agreed to. Institutional weakness undermines contract enforcement in most countries. So progress needs to be made regarding the laws on property rights. Now, when we look at changing political economies, there's this ideological conflict between collectivism and individualism that is less prevalent today. What we see is that Western ideology is more widespread. So markets that were formerly off limits to Western businesses are now opening. And we saw this with the fall of the Soviet Union, for example. So Western organizations ventured into that region that was previously off limits. But of course, the political risks are huge. Will the democracy survive? Will the totalitarianism return? How big a risk is associated with this investment? And we can ask this question of China currently. So is that financial system stable? All right, now let's switch gears and talk about managerial implications, right? So in terms of what does all this mean for management practices? Well, essentially, we need to look at each nation state, each foreign market that we want to enter, and we need to do an assessment of the overall attractiveness of doing business in that country. To do that, we look at the benefits, the costs, and the risks involved. So countries are more likely to have a sustained rate of economic growth when they are democratic, when they're market-based economies, and when they have strong property rights. So that's where we start. We look at those three things when we're trying to decide whether to enter a foreign market. And the size of the market, the potential of that market, the current and the future forecast purchasing power of its consumers. These are measures that we would consider to assess the benefits of entering that market. We want to be capturing first mover advantages by being an early entrant in a foreign market, especially if it's a market in transition, if it's a nation state in transition towards a market-based economy. Then maybe it's a good idea to be an early entrant. But of course, there's higher risks involved with being an early entrant and higher costs. Maybe your organization is more conservative, and maybe you wait too long and you end up incurring late mover disadvantages. So we need to look at a country's economic system and their property rights system or enforcement, because these are good predictors of economic prospects. So moving from considering benefits to looking at costs of doing business with a particular nation state. Let's look at the political system in the first place, right? Is bribery part of how you do business in this foreign country. What about the economic level? Is it, are the necessary business infrastructures in place or not? And how are the local laws and regulations enforced? How are the contract laws, are they well established? Are they well enforced? In terms of risks, we need to look at political risk, economic risk, and legal risk. So political risk is about the likelihood that the political forces will cause drastic changes in a country's business environment that will adversely affect the profit and other organisational goals. So, what's the political risk in this country? As well as political risk, what's the economic risk? The likelihood that the economic mismanagement will cause drastic effects in a country's business environment and adversely affect the profit of an organisation. Then the legal risk. What's the likelihood that a trading partner will break a contract for their benefit rather than yours? Or maybe they'll take your property rights. So overall, we assess the attractiveness of a foreign market, and we, do a cost-benefit analysis and look at the risks associated and make a decision. So all things being equal, the benefit cost risk trade-off is likely to be most favourable in political stable nations, and this can include developed as well as developing nations. But they're probably going to have a free market system, and they're probably not going to have dramatic inflation rates or private sector debt. So this slide is showing us what we've just said in terms of managerial implications, showing us graphically that when we're looking at the overall attractiveness of entering a particular country, we assess the benefits, such as the size of the economy and the rate of growth of that economy. We look at the costs, the level of corruption, the level of infrastructure or not, the legal costs, and we look at the risks. So what's the political risk? Is there social unrest? What's the economic risk? Is there economic mismanagement? What's the legal risks? How do they deal with property rights? And there you go. That is chapter 3 from Hill. Thank you very much for your attention today. I hope to see you again, and see you soon.